January 17th, 1781. A cattle pasture in upcountry South Carolina called the Cowpens. The grass is brittle with frost. The air still smells of wood smoke from the campfires that burned out an hour ago, and a 44-year-old man with a ruined back is walking the line of his soldiers in the half-light before dawn. He has scars from 500 lashes laid down by a British Army drummer 25 years earlier. He cannot write a clean letter. He owns a small farm in the Shenandoah Valley, and most of the men around him own farms just like it. In a few hours, he is going to take the most feared cavalryman in the British Empire, a 26-year-old aristocrat who has never lost an open field fight against rebels, and he is going to erase him from the war. In under 60 minutes, Banastra Tarleton's elite corps will be dead, wounded or kneeling in the mud as prisoners. The man who beats him cannot read a tactical manual. The plan he uses will be taught at West Point 240 years later. So how does a semi-literate Virginia farmer destroy Britain's most dangerous field commander in less than an hour, and in the process, unravel an empire's entire southern strategy? If you had asked anyone in London in the winter of 1780 how the American war was going, the answer would have been the same in the coffee houses, in Parliament, and in the King's drawing room. The rebellion in the South was already finished. Charleston had fallen in May, the largest American surrender of the entire war. At Camden in August, Horatio Gates had led a Continental army onto open ground against Cornwallis, and watched it disintegrate in 20 minutes, with Gates himself riding 60 miles to the rear before he stopped. The British held every port that mattered on the southern coast. Loyalist militia were rising. The Continental Congress was broke. The Continental dollar was worth pennies, and the man Washington sent south to save the Carolinas, Nathaniel Greene, was inheriting an army that existed mostly on paper. If you had asked any professional soldier in the world what would happen when Tarleton's British Legion caught a rebel force of farmers and part-time militia in open country, the answer was obvious. It had already happened, again and again all year. The rebels would break, the cavalry would ride them down, and the war in the South would end. They had no idea what was coming, because what was at stake at the Cowpens on that frozen January morning was not a small skirmish in a forgotten pasture. The Southern Campaign was the British plan to win the entire war. London had concluded, correctly in some ways, that New England could not be conquered, but the South could be peeled away colony by colony, starting in Georgia, rolling up through the Carolinas, into Virginia, and finally squeezing Washington from below. Every battle in this theater was a brick in that wall. If Cornwallis kept his momentum, if Tarleton kept hunting and shattering rebel detachments one by one, the war was, in any meaningful sense, lost. The French alliance would wither. The Continental Army would starve through another winter without a victory to sell. The whole rebellion would become an inconvenient bookkeeping problem to be settled at a negotiating table where the Americans held nothing. And on the other side of the ledger, the man Cornwallis trusted to do the hunting was Banastra Tarleton, 26 years old, hero of Charleston, the cavalryman the rebels called the Butcher. He was untouchable. He had never been beaten in the field. He moved faster than any rebel could react. He had killed or captured every American detachment he had cornered for a year. So the question is not whether a backcountry farmer could match a British general on paper. He could not. The question is how he engineered an outcome the paper said was impossible. Daniel Morgan was born in 1736 in New Jersey, the son of poor Welsh immigrants, and at 17 he did what poor 17-year-olds in colonial America did when home became unbearable. He ran. He walked west into the Virginia frontier, with no money, no education, and a body built like a draft horse. He found work as a wagoner, hauling supplies through the wilderness for whoever would pay him. He could barely sign his own name. He drank, he brawled, and by the time he was 20, he was already known in the Shenandoah Valley as a man you did not pick a fight with twice. Then the French and Indian War found him, and he hired out as a teamster for the British Army. Here is the wound that made him. Sometime in 1756, the story goes, Morgan struck a British officer. By some accounts, the officer struck him first with the flat of a sword. The punishment was 500 lashes. 500. Most men did not survive. 300. Morgan survived. And for the rest of his life he told the same joke about it. The drummer who counted the strokes had miscounted, he insisted, and only given him 499, so the British Empire still owed him 1. He said it laughing. He said it with his back turned, because the scars never closed properly. Every time Daniel Morgan took off his shirt for the next 46 years, the British Army was on his skin. He settled after the war on a small farm near Winchester, Virginia. He grew prosperous in a modest backcountry way, enough land, enough livestock, enough standing to be elected a militia officer when the colonies began to drift toward rebellion. He was not a gentleman. He was not a reader of Caesar or Vauban. What he knew from the road, from the woods, from 20 years of watching how men actually behaved when they were tired and frightened and outnumbered. He knew that frontier riflemen could pick an officer off a horse at 200 yards. He knew that militia would not stand against bayonets, no matter how brave they were, because he had been militia. And he knew, in his scarred bones, exactly how a confident British officer thought. He had been beneath one. His opposite number was a young man named Banastra Tarleton, and Tarleton was everything Morgan was not. He was born in Liverpool in 1754, into a wealthy merchant family. He went to Oxford and did not finish. His father died and left him a fortune, which he gambled away in London in under 3 years. With his last money he purchased a commission in the cavalry, because cavalry was glamorous. And he was 21, and the war in America promised both reputation and prize money. He arrived in New York in 1776. By the end of that same year, still only 22, he led the small troop that captured the American General Charles Lee in his nightshirt at a tavern in New Jersey. He was promoted. He was praised. He was, almost overnight, the rising celebrity of the British officer corps. By 1780 he commanded the British Legion, a mixed corps of cavalry and light infantry in green coats that became the most efficient pursuit force in the British Army. And in May of that year, at a place called the Waxhaws, his legion caught a Virginia regiment under Colonel Buford in open ground. What followed became the most infamous incident of the Southern War. American accounts said the Virginians tried to surrender and were cut down anyway, sabred while their hands were up. British accounts said Tarleton's horse was shot from under him at the moment of surrender. His men believed him killed, and they took revenge before he could regain control. The truth was probably worse than the British version, and better than the American one, but it did not matter, because from that day forward, Tarleton's quarter became a phrase in every rebel camp from Virginia to Georgia. It meant he gives no quarter, so give him none. He had become a symbol, and a symbol believes its own press. Here is Tarleton's wound, the one Morgan would use against him. He had won every encounter he had ever led in America by doing exactly the same thing. See the enemy, ride at the enemy, hit the enemy before they could form. It had never failed. He had no other gear. When you have only ever won by charging, you stop believing in any plan that does not involve charging. He had become the perfect instrument, sharp, fast, lethal, and entirely predictable to anyone who understood that the instrument had only one note. And looming behind him was Lord Charles Cornwallis, 42 years old, Eton and Cambridge, an aristocrat who had actually opposed the taxes that started the war but who served his king regardless. Cornwallis was the architect of the Southern strategy. He believed that aggressive offensive movement would shatter the rebellion before its French allies could matter. He trusted Tarleton because Tarleton delivered. He was about to send him on one more chase. In December of 1780, the man Washington had finally sent to the South arrived at the wreckage of Gates's army at Charlotte. Nathaniel Greene was 38 years old, a Rhode Island ironmaster, a self-taught soldier, and a Quaker, or rather, a former Quaker, because the Friends meeting had expelled him for taking up arms. He had taught himself war the way Morgan had taught himself the road, by reading every book he could find and then watching what actually worked. He had smuggled military treatises into his father's pacifist household. As a teenager, he had served as Washington's quartermaster general, which sounds dull and was in fact the hardest job in the army. He understood logistics, the way Tarleton understood a charge, and when he looked at the map of the Carolinas in December 1780, with his army outnumbered, half-starved and barefoot, he saw something no professional European officer would have seen. He saw that being weaker could be a weapon if he used it correctly. He would later describe his campaign with a line that has followed him through every history book since. "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again." And on a cold December evening, Greene sat down with Daniel Morgan in a farmhouse in North Carolina and proposed something that, by every textbook in Europe, was insane. He proposed to take the smaller of two American forces and split it in half. Every officer Greene served with told him not to do it. Splitting an inferior army in the face of a superior one was, in the language of every military manual in the Western world, the surest way to be destroyed in detail. That is, to be smashed one piece at a time by an enemy who concentrated against each fragment in turn. Frederick the Great had built his entire reputation on doing exactly that to opponents foolish enough to divide. Cornwallis had been schooled in those same campaigns. He had read those same books. And Greene, the self-taught Quaker who had read them too, looked at his ragged 2,300-man army, looked at the map of the Carolinas, and said, "Divide. Send Morgan west of the Catawba River with about 600 men. Keep the rest in the east. And invite Cornwallis to do the impossible, to be in two places at once, or to choose which half of the rebel army to chase and leave the other half free. This is the move that makes Cowpens possible. Without it, Tarleton is never sent off alone. Without it, Morgan is never a separate command with the authority to fight his own battle on his own ground." So the first question of this whole story is not how Morgan wins at the Cowpens. The first question is how a Quaker ironmaster talks a frontier farmer into walking into the open jaws of the most aggressive army in the world, and how by doing it he forces that army to bite down on nothing. Because Greene was not actually offering Cornwallis a meal, he was offering him bait. And the bait was a man who knew exactly how it felt to be hunted. Here is what Greene understood that Cornwallis did not. In conventional European warfare, an army's strength is its mass, the concentrated weight of infantry, cavalry, and artillery moving as a single fist. To divide that fist is to give away your only advantage. But Greene was not fighting a conventional war, and his army was not a fist. It was a small, hungry, half-shod scattering of regulars and militia spread across a landscape the British did not control. His real weapon was not his men. His real weapon was the Carolina backcountry itself. 80,000 square miles of forest, swamp, river and farm that swallowed supply wagons whole. Every mile Cornwallis marched away from the coast. His army got hungrier. Every day he stayed in the interior. His soldiers wore out shoes, his horses ate through forage, and his communications stretched thinner. Time, in the South, was not on the British side. Time was on the side of whoever could keep moving and refuse to be caught. So Greene reasoned in steps. Step 1. If I stay concentrated, Cornwallis stays concentrated, and his concentrated force outnumbers mine and outclasses mine, and eventually he forces a battle I cannot win, like Camden. Step 2. If I split into two forces on either side of his position, Cornwallis cannot ignore either of them. The western detachment threatens the British outpost at 96, and the eastern force threatens his line of communication back to Charleston. Step 3. Forced to respond to both, Cornwallis must either split his own army or pick one of mine to chase, and leave the other free to do damage. Step 4. Whichever he splits off will, by definition, be weaker than the whole British army, and small enough that one of my detachments might actually beat it. The division does not weaken me, the division forces him to weaken himself. And the second half of the mechanism, the part that makes it more than just a paper trick, is the man Greene chose for the western detachment. He did not send a polished Continental officer. He sent Daniel Morgan, because Morgan was the one general in the American army who actually understood the backcountry as a system. Morgan knew that the Western militia would rally to a commander who looked and talked like them. He knew which roads were passable in January and which were not. He knew that a small force in his hands could move faster than a large British column could pursue. Greene was not just dividing his army, he was matching a tool to a terrain. Picture the map. Cornwallis sits at Winnsboro in central South Carolina, between Greene's two detachments. To his east, across rivers and swamps, sits Greene himself with the main force. To his west, across the Broad River, sits Morgan with about 600 men and the promise that more militia will join him as he moves. Cornwallis looks at this and sees what Greene wants him to see. The western detachment is the smaller, weaker, more isolated half. It can be cut off from reinforcement. It can be destroyed in detail. And the man for that job, the cavalry predator who has never failed at exactly that kind of mission, is camped a day's ride away in his own quarters, polishing his sword. Cornwallis writes the order. Tarleton is to take roughly 1,000 men, his legion of cavalry and light infantry, plus a battalion of regulars from the 71st Highlanders, plus 2 grasshopper cannon, and find Morgan, pin him against the rivers, and destroy him. It is exactly the assignment Tarleton wants. It is exactly the assignment Greene wants him to want. The trap, at the campaign level, is now set, and the man walking into it does not know he is the one being hunted. Tarleton moves on January 1st, 1781, and from the first day, the chase has the shape of a man chasing his own reflection. The country between him and Morgan is a wilderness of swollen creeks, ice in the shallows, and pine forest where the road is a wagon rut between black trees. The rains are constant. The rivers, the Pakeley, the Tiger, the Enorie, the Broad, rise and fall on the timetable of the storms, and a ford that is knee-deep at noon is shoulder-deep by midnight. Tarleton's horses are eating through their forage. His men are wet and cold and complaining, but he pushes them, because pushing is what he does, and because every report from his scouts tells him Morgan is just ahead, just out of reach, just over the next river. Morgan, meanwhile, is doing exactly what Greene asked him to do. He is moving, he is gathering, he is dragging the British deeper into a country where no British supply wagon can follow. Local militia, the ones who lost cousins at the Waxhaws, the ones whose farms were burned by Tarleton's foraging parties last summer, drift out of the woods and join his column in 2s and 3s and 10s. By the second week of January, his 600 men have grown closer to 900. He has Andrew Pickens, a Presbyterian elder turned partisan commander, with 150 backcountry riflemen who can hit a man at 200 yards. He has William Washington, the cavalry colonel, cousin to the commander-in-chief, and his 80 dragoons. He has John Eager Howard, a 28-year-old Marylander, with 300 of the finest Continental infantry left in the South. The detachment Cornwallis thinks is shrinking is quietly growing. On January 15th, Morgan crosses the Pakeley River and camps. On the 16th, Tarleton's scouts find his fires still burning at the old campsite. Morgan has slipped away again. Tarleton presses harder now. He cuts his column's baggage. He marches his men through the night with 2 hours of sleep. His soldiers are eating cold corn out of their pockets. By the pre-dawn of January 17th, the British Legion has been awake for 16 hours, has marched 12 miles in the dark over frozen mud, and is closing on a place called the Cowpens, a wide grazing pasture used by local cattle drovers, where their scouts report the American campfires are burning bright, and the rebel force has, at last, stopped running. To Tarleton, in his exhaustion and his certainty, this looks like a man who has finally been caught. Morgan has his back to the Broad River. He has only one road of retreat, and it crosses a flooded ford. He is in open country where cavalry rules. He has militia in his line, which means he has men who will not stand. He has been chased for 2 weeks, and he is by every sign Tarleton has been trained to read. Cornered. What Tarleton cannot see, what he is institutionally incapable of seeing, because no British staff officer in 1781 would believe it, is that every one of those signals is a choice. Morgan chose the pasture. Morgan chose the river at his back, because he wants his men to know there is nowhere to run, so they will fight. Morgan chose to stop running last night, because he wanted Tarleton to arrive exhausted, on a battlefield Morgan had walked over the previous afternoon, with the dawn behind the American line and the rising sun in British eyes. The hunter has been led by the leash for 100 miles. He has just been led the last mile, into a pasture where the cattle have been moved out, and the riflemen are already in the trees. Picture it from above. The British column emerges from the pine forest in the grey half-light at about 6 in the morning. The men are wet, hungry, and have not eaten a real meal in 2 days. Their breath steams in the cold air. And ahead of them, on a gentle rise of open ground a quarter-mile away, they see what they came to find. Rebel skirmishers, a line of militia behind them, and somewhere in the smoke and distance, presumably a few Continental regulars who will run as soon as the cavalry hits. They see exactly what they have come to destroy. They will not know, until it is too late, that this is the last thing they will ever see clearly. The first decision of the day is Tarleton's, and he makes it in less than 5 minutes. He does not deploy carefully, he does not rest his men, he does not wait for the daylight to grow. He looks at the field, sees rebels in front of him, and orders his line into immediate attack formation. Infantry in the center, Highlanders on the right, dragoons on the wings, 2 cannon forward, cavalry reserve behind. It is the same disposition he has used in every successful pursuit of the last year. It is, in fact, the only disposition he knows. The trap of Green's strategic split is now complete. Cornwallis is 60 miles away, across rivers that will not stop rising for 3 more days. No reinforcement can possibly reach this field before nightfall. And Banastra Tarleton has just ordered a tired column to attack on ground a Virginia farmer chose for him. Greene split his army, Cornwallis split his, and the smaller, deadlier half is now standing alone in front of a man who has been preparing for this exact morning his entire life. Before we walk onto that field beside Morgan and see what he actually built there, before we understand why he asked his militia to retreat, why he put a river at his back, and why a man who could not read a tactical manual was about to execute one of the most studied maneuvers in military history. There is one thing worth saying. This channel exists because battles like this one are not accidents and not miracles. They are designs. If you want to keep seeing how those designs actually worked, subscribe. There is a new one every week, and the next one is bigger than this. Now, back to the pasture. The British line is forming, and Daniel Morgan is about to do something no European officer of his century would have dared. The night before the battle, Morgan does not sleep. He walks the camp. He goes from one campfire to the next, and what he does there is the thing every account of Cowpens agrees on, even the British ones. He sits down with the militia, the farmers, the part-timers, the men who have in every battle of this war broken and run when the bayonets came at them, and he tells them the truth. He tells them he knows they will not hold against British steel. He tells them he is not going to ask them to. He tells them what he is going to ask them to do exactly, and he tells them why. He shows them his back. He laughs about the lashes. He calls them by name. And then he tells them his plan. And the plan is the most insulting thing any general has ever asked of his own troops. And also the most flattering, because no general had ever before treated militia like an actual tactical instrument with a known limitation, instead of like cowards who needed to be shamed into pretending to be regulars. He told them he was building a battle around the assumption that they would retreat. Their retreat was the weapon. 2 shots, pick your man, and pick the officer if you can see his epaulets, fire twice, and then walk to the rear. Not run. Walk. There will be regulars behind you to catch the British when they chase you. There will be cavalry behind them. You will not be deserting. You will be doing your job. And when it is done, he would see them all on the other side of the field. He shook their hands. He went to sleep. And in the morning, every man on that field knew his role in a machine that had not yet been built anywhere else in the Western world. So picture the Cowpens as Morgan saw it on the afternoon of January 16th, the day before. It is a gently rolling pasture about 500 yards wide and 700 deep, sloping upward from south to north. The grass is winter brown, cropped short by cattle. There are scattered trees, no underbrush, no fences, the open ground a cavalry commander dreams about. The broad river is 5 miles behind it. The pine woods on either side are thin enough to ride through, but thick enough to hide a man with a rifle. And the slight rise from south to north, perhaps 40 feet over the length of the field, does one thing that becomes the architecture of the whole battle. From the south, where the British will enter, you cannot see what is on the back slope. This is the canvas. Now Morgan paints in 3 lines. Line 1, the farthest forward. About 150 riflemen, mostly from Georgia and North Carolina, scattered loose in the open and under the edge of the trees on the flanks. These are the sharpshooters. Their muskets are not muskets. They are long Pennsylvania rifles, accurate to 250 yards, 3 times the range of a British smoothbore. Their job is simple. Wait until the British close to within shooting distance. Pick the officers, the men with the epaulets, the gorgets, the bright sashes. Fire 1 or 2 aimed shots, then fall back through the second line. They are the first cut. They are also the first piece of bait, line 2, about 150 yards behind line 1. Roughly 300 militia, mostly South Carolinians under Andrew Pickens, formed in a loose line across the front of the field. This is the line Morgan spoke to last night. Their orders are exact. Hold until the British are within 50 yards. 2 volleys. Aim low. Morgan reportedly told them to look for the epaulets, because killing officers kills the British command structure. Then retire in good order, around the left flank of the third line, and reform behind it. They are not a wall. They are a speed bump engineered to detonate twice and then withdraw. Line 3, on the crest of the rise about another 150 yards behind line 2, the heart of the army. 300 Continental regulars under John Eager Howard, plus a battalion of Virginia State troops who are Continental veterans in all but name. These are the disciplined infantry. They are out of sight from the British starting position because of the slope. They have not been seen by Tarleton's scouts. As the British approach the rise, they will believe, they will be certain, that the militia line was the main American body, and that breaking it means winning the field. Behind line 3, hidden in a small swale, sits William Washington with his 80 dragoons and 45 mounted Georgia volunteers, completely invisible. Now look at the geometry of what is going to happen. The British will come up the slope, the riflemen will sting them and fall back. The militia will fire 2 volleys and fall back. To Tarleton, this looks like the rebel front collapsing in stages, exactly what he has seen at Camden, at Waxhaws, at every fight he has ever won. He will press harder. His line will lose cohesion as it chases. His men will arrive at the crest of the rise, tired, disordered, and convinced they are about to overrun a broken enemy. And on the crest, they will discover for the first time the Continental line, disciplined, fresh, waiting, and behind that line, in the swale, cavalry they did not know existed. Morgan has not built a defensive position. He has built a funnel that looks like a collapse. 2 shots and a walk to the rear. That is the entire mechanism. The brilliance is in the cruelty of how well he understood his own men, and how well he understood the man coming up the hill. At 7 in the morning, January 17th, the British come out of the pines and into the bottom of the pasture, and they come fast. Tarleton does not pause. He has been awake too long to pause. The 71st Highlanders are pushed to his far right. The Legion infantry hold the center. His 2 grasshopper guns are wheeled forward and unlimbered. The Legion dragoons are on the wings. He sees the rebel skirmish line ahead, a scatter of men under the trees, and he orders his cavalry to ride them off. 50 dragoons in green coats trot forward, then break into a canter, then a gallop. They expect the militia skirmishers to break and run. The skirmishers do not. They wait. 200 yards, 150, 125. And then the rifles speak. The first volley from line 1 drops 15 dragoons out of the saddle, and almost every one of them is an officer or a sergeant. The cavalry charge wavers. A second ragged volley empties more saddles. The dragoons turn and ride back to their own line. Tarleton has just lost a third of his cavalry vanguard, and the battle is 2 minutes old. He does not adjust. He orders the main infantry line forward, drums beating, bayonets fixed. The British line steps off across the cold pasture. Perfect spacing, perfect discipline, perfect doctrine. They climb the gentle slope, Smoke begins to drift from the rifles that have melted back through the second line. The riflemen are doing exactly what they were told. They are walking, not running, threading between the militia and reforming in the rear. The British line reaches musket range of the militia. The militia hold their fire. Morgan, on horseback behind line 3, is riding the back of the field shouting one phrase over and over. Every account agrees on the substance, if not the exact words. Old Morgan was never beaten. He needs the militia to give him those 2 volleys. He needs it more than anything in his life. At 50 yards, the militia line erupts. 300 muskets fired low, fired at officers. The first British rank staggers. The militia reload, faster than they have ever reloaded, hands shaking with cold and fear. A second volley. The British officer corps along that line is being shredded. By the end of the morning, every British officer in the 71st's leading companies will be dead or wounded. And then, exactly as Morgan asked, the militia turn and walk to the rear, around the left flank of the third line, on their way to reform behind the cavalry. To Tarleton, watching from below, this is the moment of victory. The skirmishers ran. The militia ran. The rebel army is collapsing in front of him in textbook order. He commits everything. He throws in his reserve infantry. He sends his last cavalry around the British left to chase the fleeing militia. He pushes his exhausted line up the slope at the run, expecting to find a routed enemy, expecting the Continentals to break the moment they see the bayonets coming. The British line crests the rise, and the rise speaks back. 300 Continentals who Tarleton has not known were there deliver a volley at 30 yards into the faces of men who were running uphill expecting to see backs. The British line stops. It does not collapse. These are professionals, the 71st Highlanders, the Legion's best infantry. But it stops, and at 30 yards, 2 armies of regulars fire into each other in a stand-up firefight that the British, who are tired, who are out of officers, who are no longer in proper order, begin to lose. For 10 minutes, the line holds against the line. Smoke so thick the men can barely see the buttons on the coats across from them. And then a Virginia company on Howard's right misunderstands an order, begins to pull back to refuse the flank. And the whole Continental line, mistaking the movement for a retreat order, begins to walk backward up the rise in perfect step. Howard rides along the line shouting that it is not a rout, it is a maneuver. Hold your formation. The British, seeing what looks like the final crack in the rebel army, surge forward at the charge, breaking their own line into a chasing mob. This is the moment Morgan has been waiting for, since the night he stood in the firelight talking to the militia. He has one order to give. He gives it. Face about. Give them one fire, and the day is ours. Howard hears it. The Continental line, walking backward in formation, stops. 300 men pivot. At 15 yards point blank, the British charging forward with bayonets level, and no longer in any kind of order. 300 muskets fire, as one. The front rank of the British charge ceases to exist. The men behind them stumble over their own dead. The smoke is so thick that for a heartbeat no one on either side can see what has happened. And in that heartbeat, 2 things start to move at the edges of Morgan's field. 2 things the British cannot see and have not planned for. 2 things that are about to close the door behind them. Morgan turned his own army's weakness into a trap, and at 15 yards, the trap shut. But the trap shutting is not the end. The trap shutting is the beginning of the part that is studied at West Point, the part where a frontier farmer, in the smoke of his own muskets, executes a maneuver from the pages of Hannibal. What happens in the next 15 minutes is the reason Cornwallis loses the war. Here is the question every military historian comes back to. The one that is, in the end, the question of this whole story. How does an unschooled man, in the smoke and confusion of close combat, with 300 shocked British regulars, 15 yards in front of him, and his own army in mid-pivot, see the whole battlefield at once, and order a maneuver that ancient generals had to walk in advance with sticks on a map? The answer is what makes Cowpens the battle it is. The answer is also the reason Cornwallis, 60 miles away, is about to lose the South. Because in the next 12 minutes, Morgan's three lines are going to do something no American army had ever done in the war. They are going to surround a professional British force in the open field. The militia who were told to retreat are going to come back. The cavalry who have been hidden are going to ride. The Continental Line is going to wheel. And the British Legion, the army Tarleton has built his career on, the corps that has won every fight it has ever picked in America, is going to die as a fighting unit in less time than it takes to cook a meal. This is a double envelopment. It is the maneuver Hannibal used at Cannae in 216 BC to destroy a Roman army twice his size. It is the maneuver every staff college in Europe taught as the highest art of the battlefield, the move only the greatest commanders ever pulled off. And it is about to be executed in real time, with no rehearsal, by a backcountry general who could barely sign his own name, against the most feared cavalry officer in the British Empire. So here is the final layer of how the trick worked. Here is what happens when all three lines come back at once. A double envelopment is not a complicated idea. It is a simple idea that is extraordinarily hard to execute. The principle is this. If an enemy is engaged in your front, and you can simultaneously attack his flanks, his sides, and ideally close behind him, you do not just defeat him, you destroy him. Because he has nowhere to retreat. Every shot fired at him comes from a different direction at once, and his command structure breaks down inside of minutes. At Cannae, Hannibal did it by letting his center fall back, which sucked the Roman army forward into a pocket, and then closing his stronger wings around them. Every man with formal military education in 1781 had read Cannae. None of them had ever seen it happen on a real battlefield. They considered it almost theoretical. Morgan's version has three moving parts, and each one was set up earlier in the battle without the British realizing. Part 1. The Continental Line, which has just delivered the point-blank volley, becomes the anvil. Howard's 300 regulars are now going to fix the British in place by lowering bayonets and charging, closing the distance to where the British, now in a chasing mob rather than a formation, cannot reform. Part 2. The right wheel. The American line, which is on a slight rise, will pivot its right end forward like a door swinging shut. This means the men on the American right will sweep around to attack the British left flank, while the men on the American left continue to press the British front. The geometry changes the entire shape of the fight. The British line, which was facing north, is suddenly being hit from the north and the east at the same time. Part 3. The cavalry and the militia. The two pieces nobody saw. William Washington's dragoons, hidden in the swale behind the rise, have been waiting. At the moment the line wheels, Washington will lead his men around the American left, charging in a wide arc to hit the British right flank, and critically, the British cavalry that has been chasing the retreating militia. And the militia themselves, who walked off the field earlier, are not gone. They have been reforming for 10 minutes behind the cavalry. Pickens is rallying them. They are now coming back onto the field, on foot, with reloaded muskets, around the American left. And they will reappear behind the British right. At the same moment, Washington's cavalry reappears behind the British left. Look at the geometry. The British have been chasing what they thought was a routed rebel army uphill. They are now at the top of the rise, exhausted, disordered, suddenly facing an organized infantry line at point-blank range. That line is wheeling its right side around onto their left flank. American cavalry are riding a wide arc around their right rear. Rallied militia, the men they thought they had broken 20 minutes earlier, are walking back onto the field behind their right. Within 90 seconds, the British will be hit from 3 directions at once, and their only escape, to the south, back down the slope, will be cut off by Washington's dragoons riding across their rear. It is Cannae, executed on a Carolina cattle pasture by a man who has never read the word canny in his life. Morgan did not read it. He felt it. He had been the man being chased. He knew what it looked like to a chaser when the chased turned around. He had built a battle that did, at full scale, what a single hunter does when he lets his prey run into a box canyon and then steps out of the brush behind him. The smoke from Howard's point-blank volley has not cleared when the Continentals lower bayonets and step forward. The British front rank, what is left of it, has no time to reform. Some men try to surrender on the spot, hands going up in the smoke. Some try to run back down the slope. Most have no idea what is happening because their officers are dead. The militia volleys, fired low at epaulettes, have killed or wounded almost every British officer in the leading companies. And a chain of command without officers is a mob. Howard rides along his line, sword raised, and gives the order for the wheel. The right end of the Continental line pivots forward. Men who are facing south swing east, then southeast. The maneuver on a parade ground takes 30 seconds. In smoke, in mud, with British soldiers 15 yards in front of them, it takes a minute and a half. It is a minute and a half no British officer is alive to interrupt. On the British right, the 71st Highlanders have pushed furthest forward, and they suddenly find that the American line they were chasing has turned a corner and is firing into them from their left side. They try to face the new threat. As they pivot, William Washington's dragoons appear from behind the rise, coming at the gallop in a wide arc around the American left. 80 cavalrymen with sabres drawn, riding into the rear left of the Highlanders. The Highlanders, the best infantry on the field, the best infantry in the British Army in America, are now being fired at from the north, charged from the east, and ridden down from the south. On the British left, the Legion infantry are still pressing against Howard's centre, when Andrew Pickens leads the rallied militia back onto the field. The militia, the men Tarleton thought he had broken, the men he had cavalry chasing somewhere off the field, are walking, reloaded, around the American right flank, and they are now firing into the British left from behind. Tarleton's reserve cavalry, the dragoons he sent to ride down the fleeing militia, are nowhere. They got tangled up with Washington's earlier movements, took fire from the woods, and have, most of them, simply ridden off the field in confusion. Tarleton sees the disaster from below. He has the Legion cavalry reserve, perhaps 200 horsemen. He orders them to charge, to break through, to rescue the infantry, to do what cavalry was supposed to do. They refuse. The Legion dragoons, the elite of his command, look at the smoke and the firing from 3 directions, and they turn their horses around. They ride away. Their commander screams at them. They keep riding. In the center of the British line, the Legion infantry begin to throw down their muskets. Some kneel. Some lie flat. An entire battalion of the 71st Highlanders, the most prestigious unit on the field, grounds arms and surrenders to a Maryland captain who has, perhaps, 6 men with him at that moment. The captain accepts the surrender of 200 regulars with a wave of his sword. The grasshopper cannon are taken by infantry running past them. The gunners simply abandon their pieces. On the British right, the Highlanders fight on for a few more minutes, back to back, in a shrinking knot, until a Continental officer rides into the middle of them and demands their surrender. And the senior surviving officer, a sergeant, because every officer is down, hands over his sword. Tarleton himself, with about 40 Legion dragoons who have not fled, makes a final charge at William Washington's cavalry. The 2 cavalry commanders meet personally in the smoke. Washington's sword breaks against Tarleton's. A Legion officer raises a sabre over Washington from behind, and Washington's 14-year-old bugler, riding beside him, shoots the officer through the shoulder with a pistol. Tarleton wheels his horse, fires his own pistol, wounds Washington's mount, and rides off the field at the gallop with what is left of his command, perhaps 50 men out of 1,000 who had walked into the pasture an hour earlier. The whole battle, from the first shot of the rifles to the last surrender, has taken less than 50 minutes. The sun is barely up. Morgan, on his horse, looks at the field, the British dead, the rows of prisoners, the abandoned cannon, the broken muskets, and the first thing he is reported to have done is to ride along the militia line, the men he asked for, 2 shots, and weep openly. Some accounts say he picked up one of the youngest militiamen and lifted him off the ground in a hug that probably tore something in his already broken back. He had built the trap. The men he treated like men had sprung it. Within the hour, the count begins. Tarleton has lost about 110 men killed, 229 wounded, 530 captured, 860 out of roughly 1,000 men. The 2 cannon are taken. 800 muskets are picked up off the field. 35 officers are prisoners. The British Legion, as a fighting formation in the American War, is finished. It will never again take the field at full strength. Morgan's losses are 25 killed and 124 wounded. In under an hour, a Virginia farmer destroyed Britain's most dangerous field commander, and the elite corps the South had been built around. And 60 miles to the east, Lord Cornwallis is still drinking his morning coffee, unaware that 1/3 of his offensive army has just ceased to exist, unaware that the man he sent to crush a rebel detachment is at this moment riding hard down a back road with 50 men, unaware that the strategic split Greene engineered 3 weeks ago has just paid off in the most catastrophic way an 18th century campaign could be paid off. When the news reaches him the next day, he will, by one account, lean so hard on his sword that he snaps it. By the day after, he will have made the decision that ends the war, to burn his own baggage and chase Greene into North Carolina at all costs. A decision that will pull him farther and farther from the coast, into the long, exhausting march that ends in October at a small Virginia tobacco port called Yorktown. The casualty math is worth holding still for a moment, because it is the language the 18th century mind understood best. Out of approximately 1,000 British and Loyalist troops who marched onto the cowpens at dawn, roughly 110 were killed outright on the field. 229 were wounded and left behind. 539 were taken prisoner. That is, 878 men lost. Morgan also captured all of Tarleton's 2 artillery pieces, 800 British muskets, 100 horses, 35 baggage wagons, 2 standards, and the entire musical instruments and pay chest of the British Legion. The American loss was 25 killed and 124 wounded. Expressed as a ratio, every American casualty produced approximately 6 British ones. Expressed as a percentage, Tarleton lost roughly 86% of his command. In the entire 18th century, in the era of linear warfare and gentlemanly battles between professional armies, there are perhaps 3 or 4 battles in the whole Western world this lopsided. Cannae is one of them. Cowpens is another. The man who produced the result could not write a paragraph without help. But the casualty math is only the first ring of the ripple. The second ring is the campaign. Cornwallis, when the news reaches him at his headquarters at Turkey Creek the following morning, makes the decision that will define the rest of his life. He cannot let Morgan rejoin Greene with that many prisoners and that much captured equipment. He orders his army to burn its own baggage train, wagons, tents, spare clothes, the personal effects of every officer including his own, and to march light, fast, and north, to catch Morgan before he can cross the Catawba River. This decision turns Cornwallis's army from a slow, supplied, sustainable force into a stripped-down pursuit column. And from the moment those wagons burn, every mile the British march is a mile they cannot supply themselves. The race to the Dan, the 3-week pursuit across North Carolina in February 1781, sees Greene and Morgan stay just ahead of Cornwallis the entire way, crossing one river after another in flooded conditions, while the British arrive at each ford just hours late. At the Dan River, Greene gets his army across in stolen boats. Cornwallis arrives at the empty south bank and looks at impassable water. He has chased a rebel army 400 miles north and caught nothing. The third ring of the ripple is the war. Cornwallis, now stranded deep in North Carolina, with no supply line and no field force to pin Greene, fights Greene at Guilford Courthouse in March. He technically wins, Greene retreats, but he loses a quarter of his army doing it. He limps to the coast at Wilmington, with too few men to control the interior. And then he makes the decision that ends everything. Believing that the Carolinas can only be held by cutting off Virginia, he marches north into Virginia in the spring of 1781. He chooses a tobacco port on the York River to wait for resupply from the British fleet. The fleet does not come. A French fleet under de Grasse arrives instead. Washington and Rochambeau, who have been waiting in New York for this exact opportunity, march south at speed. By October 19th, 8 months and 2 days after Cowpens, Cornwallis's army of 8,000 men stacks its arms at Yorktown, while a British band plays "The World Turned Upside Down." The American Revolution is, in any meaningful military sense, over. None of that happens without cowpens. The human coda is quieter. Daniel Morgan's body finally broke. The chronic sciatica that had been hounding him for years went from painful to incapacitating during the race to the dam. And within weeks of his greatest victory, he was sent home to Winchester, Virginia, to recover. He would never again command troops in the field. He served one term in Congress as a Federalist, ran a successful mill, and died in 1802 at 65, his back still scarred. Nathaniel Greene received from a grateful South Carolina a plantation he could not afford to maintain. He died in Georgia in 1786, at 43, from heat stroke, deeply in debt. William Washington was wounded and captured later that same campaign, and married into a wealthy Charleston family. John Eager Howard became governor of Maryland and a United States senator. Banastra Tarleton escaped to England, was elected to Parliament for Liverpool, wrote a memoir blaming everyone but himself, defended the slave trade in 78 separate speeches, and lived comfortably until 1833, dying a baronet at 78. Daniel Morgan's farmers mostly went back to their farms. Cowpens is still studied. It is taught at West Point. It is taught at Sandhurst. It is taught at the Army War College as one of the cleanest examples in modern military history of how a smaller, less professional force can defeat a larger, better trained one by accommodating its own weaknesses instead of pretending they do not exist. The lesson the textbooks pull out is technical. The use of layered defense, the planned withdrawal, the coordinated envelopment, the integration of irregulars and regulars in a single design. But the deeper lesson is human, and it is the one military instructors actually want their students to absorb. Morgan won because he respected the men he led enough to tell them the truth about themselves and to build a plan around who they actually were. He did not demand of his militia what Gates had demanded at Camden, that they pretend to be British grenadiers. He demanded what they could give. He gave them a job small enough to do, important enough to matter, and dignified enough to take pride in. 2 shots and walk away. It is, in its way, an idea that has nothing to do with the 18th century. It is an idea about how leadership works in any organization where the people on the front line are not, and cannot be, the people in the leadership books. The pasture is still there. It is a national battlefield now, 842 acres of preserved ground in Cherokee County, South Carolina, about an hour northwest of the city of Spartanburg. The Park Service keeps the field roughly as it was. The gentle slope from south to north, the scattered trees, the wide brown grass in winter and green in summer. There is a paved walking trail that follows the route of the 3 lines, and small markers tell you where the riflemen stood, where the militia formed, where Howard's regulars wheeled, where Washington's dragoons came around the rise. There is a granite monument to the militia, which is unusual. Most battlefield monuments name only the regulars. On a cold January morning, if you stand at the bottom of the slope where Tarleton's line first stepped out of the pines, you can see the whole field, the rise, the swale behind it, the line of woods where the riflemen waited, and you can understand, in a way no map can teach you, why the man at the top of the rise won. The British were looking uphill into the sun. The Americans were looking downhill into shadow. Morgan walked this ground the afternoon before the battle. He knew what he was doing. There is no statue of Daniel Morgan on the field. There is a small one in the town square of Spartanburg, 12 miles away. He is on horseback. The plaque does not mention the lashes. It does not mention the joke about the drummer. It does not mention that he could barely write. It says only that he commanded the American forces at Cowpens on January 17th, 1781, and that he won. The men who served under him, the farmers, would probably have said that was enough. There is a particular kind of genius that does not look like genius. It does not write books. It does not, in Morgan's case, sign its own letters without help. It looks, instead, like a man with a scarred back walking from campfire to campfire on a freezing night, telling a group of frightened farmers that he knows exactly what they are afraid of, and that he is going to build the whole battle around it, and that their fear is, in fact, the weapon. The British Army did not lose at Cowpens because it was outgunned. It lost because it was outthought by a man who understood his own people better than any aristocrat ever understood his. 2 shots, and walk away. That was the plan. That was the war. That, in the end, was Yorktown. If you want to see how the other impossible battles in this war actually worked, the ones the textbooks gloss over, the ones where the smaller side wins because somebody on it was paying attention, subscribe. There is a new one every week. And in the comments, tell me which battle you want next. The one I keep coming back to is Saratoga. But the one that nobody talks about, and probably should, is King's Mountain. You decide.